first speaker is going to be Dr. Ian Dodkins, and he will be talking about the function and design of floating treatment wetlands.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm Ian Dodkins. I'm at Swansea University, and we have a group called SEACAMS. I won't go into many details, but basically we assist companies particularly in Wales with projects related to coastal catchments and marine work. So some of you will have heard about floating treatment wetlands, but I'm going to start off with a bit of history. Basically, floating treatment wetlands is floating vegetation, and it's made often to treat water for conservation. But floating vegetation is also natural. So this is the floating islands of Yucatan in Mexico, and it's a highly mineralized water, and they think they developed by calcium carbonate precipitating and then plants established in these islands, and now they just bob around in the water, blown by the wind, and they get bashed around, and so they're pretty much round because of all the impacts. And that's an overhead view. You can see the wind's blowing them over into that little corner there. Also in Uganda, this is actually from a news item this year, in June this year. 20-acre island broke off in Lake Victoria, and there's 10 artists that live in thatched huts on this island. And they've been warned about it possibly sinking, but they still live there. And they have a flag, so they know where they've moved during the night. And this is probably the most famous one in Lake Titicaca in Peru. And so these are made from reeds, and they live on these islands. So these islands are not attached to the bottom. These are floating around. Okay, they anchor these ones here. They anchor them down, but all of these islands you see, they don't have contact with the sediment on the bottom. They're floating. And this is in India. You've got 4,000 people living in Loktak Lake in India on artificial floating islands. So as far back as the 11th century, you have Chinese and Vietnamese that were actually treating water with floating vegetation. So this is a zola, and it grows very well in nutrient-enriched waters. But they would then harvest this, so they're actually taking the azolla as well from this field, and then they use it for nutrients for applying to other fields. And water in Southeast Asia, water hyacinth, it's a pest in many areas, but in Southeast Asia, water hyacinth has been used to remove nutrients as well. So floating treatment wetlands, sometimes called constructed floating wetlands, are effectively beds of vegetation that are floating around, and they have very many different uses. First one here is stormwater runoff treatment. Then we have, this is actually to assist, the second one's to assist with agricultural runoff for nature conservation, and the bottom two are erosion prevention as well. So it can act as a buffer to reduce friction from the water and waves. Okay, so the basic principles. You have a medium which you are supporting the plants in. So for products such as Biohaven, like a blown plastic medium with a high surface area where the roots can penetrate, and it's injected with polystyrene, and so that floats, and then you'll have the plants planted within that. As the can enter it in various directions, but the water's passing through like a normal basin and will be intercepted by these roots, and the roots will actually intercept the particles, and they'll cling to the roots and slough off, and so basically it assists with the particle settling. You also get absorption by the plants and microbiological activity as well. So on the roots is a very high surface area for microbiological activity. So you've got your biological uptake, physical filtrations and settling, and microbiological uptake and processing. Okay, so let's think about the importance of these three mechanisms in phosphorus removal. So what would you think would be, well, given that about, in a conventional treatment basin without floating islands, you're talking about 40 to 70% P removal, where you can get up to about 81, 84% with a floating island. Now, how much do you think of that is phosphorus? At that 81%, how much do you think is taken up by the plants in biological uptake by the plants? So hands up if you think it's less than 10%. Okay, maybe 10 to 20%. Okay, greater than 20%. Okay, so it's about 6%. Okay, so actually, in terms of phosphorus removal, you're only getting about 6% taken up by the plants. And also, that's stored in the plant tissue, so if you want that to be consistent, you'll have to harvest. Okay, it'll take a few years. As they're growing, they'll stabilise, they'll still be taking up phosphorus. But then, once it's stabilised and you've got a stable floating vegetation bank, and you get an organic matter cycling, you will have to harvest if you want that to continue, that removal to continue. Okay, so what about the roots, the filtration and settling? Well, the settling in the water column and also the roots aiding the settling. Less than 10%? Anybody less than 20%? Okay, less than 50%? Okay, and anybody greater than 50%? Okay, yeah, 75%. So in terms of phosphorus removal, the actual settling, and that's not just due to roots, it's due to general settling, but the roots assist greatly with the settling of the phosphorus, the phosphorus-bound sediments. So, and again, that settles to the bottom, and over about 8 to 10 years, you get consistent phosphorus removal, but then that's trapped there, and you have a dynamic interaction with the water column. So if you don't dredge that out, what actually is going to happen is you're going to start get phosphorus release, and if you don't do anything for 10, 12 years, you can actually have higher phosphorus output than in your input because it's being released from the sediments. So what about the microbiological uptake? Less than 10%? Yeah, there's not many percentage left, is there? Okay. Well, actually, they will uptake the phosphorus, but it tends to be cycled because it's not removed from the system. So they'll uptake it very quickly and then be released. So there's that dynamic interaction. Okay, so this is if the basin's functioning well. So you're getting about 81% removal. So some of it's not being removed, but obviously it depends how you manage the basin and the conditions. Okay, so nitrogen obviously is a different story. You've got some of the nitrogen gets buried in the sediments. A very small amount is volatilized as ammonia. You've got uptake again, ammonia nitrate. You've got microbiological processes converting ammonium to nitrate. And the good thing about the nitrogen is you can actually get it released from the system as nitrogen gas due to biological activity, microbiological activity. So it's a nice, if you've got that denitrification occurring, that is a nice way for the nitrogen to come out of the system because it's, well, the nitrogen gas is non-toxic, it's just mostly the highest constituent of the air. So basically, it's a good way for taking that nutrient out of the system. Okay, so let's go through this again. Biological uptake. Less than 10% for nitrogen removal by uptake by the plants. Okay, 10 to 20%. Okay, less than 50% and greater than 50%. Okay, about 7%. So again, there's not as much being taken up by the plants, and it's the same thing. If you want it to be consistently taken up, you have to harvest it. the physical will beat up a mineralisation in the sediments at the bottom. These figures are averages based on a lot of studies, so it will depend on the basin, but really that's, for a plant uptake, that's pretty much the limit. So physical mineralisation, less than 20%, greater than 20%. Yeah, okay, about 5% really. It really varies depending on the conditions of the basin. What about the release of the nitrogen gas by denitrification and the microbiological processing? Less than 20% or less than 50%? Okay, about 62%. So in terms of the nitrogen removal, it's the microbiological activity that is the principal thing that you need to optimize to remove the nitrates, ammonium. So that's dependent on the root surface area. If your media, so you want a high surface area for your floating media, and also the conditions within the basin. Okay, so you've got about 26% not removed as well. Okay, so really there's a lot of flexibility in the way that these floating treatment systems are functioning. For example, if you've got a stormwater retention pond, these are generally catching runoff from roads, and so you've got a lot of metals. What ideally you want then is to precipitate metals so they sink to the bottom. So a good way to do that is actually to reduce the oxygen content in the water, and that helps to precipitate out the metals. They combine with organic compounds and precipitate out. So what you can actually restricts the oxygen exchange with the surface. So if you put 100% floating island on a stormwater pond, you'll make it anoxic and your metals will precipitate out. So it's a good way to trap metals. Another benefit with the stormwater retention pond is that generally what you have is the flows are very variable depending on the rainfall. So the water level rises when you get a storm, and it's all running off the roads, and then drops in the drier times. The roots are always at the same level within that water column. So the microbiological activity and the uptake by the plants is always there at the same location. Whereas what tends to happen if you have plants growing at the bottom is that they can get drowned very easily by the rising water. And it's just showing some anchoring mechanisms here, basically a little block attached to that. So generally when you're using them for something like this, you don't want them moving around or getting battered, but it depends really what your purpose is. So ammonium removal. Okay, so this is a focus on nitrification, conversion of ammonium or nitrite to nitrate. This is useful, for example, in aquaculture, where there's a lot of ammonia produced by the fish, and which is toxic, so you want to convert it to a less toxic substance for the fish, being nitrate. So you're trying to do the opposite, actually. You're aerating the water so you can put bubbles in. You can have a 20% less coverage of islands or less, or you put little bubblers in, or even a little fountain. And calcium carbonate, or making it more alkaline, can actually assist with the activity of the microbes. For nitrate removal, denitrification, where you're trying to release that nitrate as gas, it's actually like the converse. You are trying to, it works better with slightly more acidic conditions, and the reason I put this is they often feed a carbon source into the denitrification to enable encourage the microbiological activity. So what you can have is actually a combined system where you'd have something like clarification, sedimentation, and then you might have something filtering here, like a filter strip, depending on the effluent. You can have a low coverage with an aerobic basin for converting ammonia to nitrate, and then an anaerobic basin for volatilization of this nitrogen. And then you can actually recirculate this, because this becomes more alkaline as the process increases, and that alkalinity helps this process, but then it becomes more acidic through here, and so the acidity actually helps that process, and also a carbon transfer from the start where you have a high BOD into that basin, and obviously you have to oxygenate it at the end. So just in the last 30 seconds, just run through a few of the photos from around the world where floating treatment systems are used. So in Louisiana, they've got 187 little islands that are used to prevent coastal erosion. This has not got any vegetation on it, but it's in Oregon, and it's a bird refuge. So it stops people or animals interfering with protected species. So this is in Canada, so a floating island just to treat waters in a storm retention pond. This is quite interesting in Australia. It's where firemen do practice, and they've got a lot of hydrocarbons when they're doing their drills from lighting fires, and so they had hydrocarbon and also algal problem, and so they've put floating islands in, which has considerably reduced the problems of hydrocarbons and algae. And also in Germany they have a floating island which is actually used as a barrier, a bit like a boom, but more attractive. It's a barrier to oil and floating rubbish. And in Switzerland, so it's a very highly, really for settling particulates out in a sedimentation pond. Vietnam, so high BOD, COD wastewater treatment. I don't know if it's that great to be swimming around in it, but and so in Germany again, this is for following actually microbiological processes where you've got flocculated particles. They've used these reed beds for settling out the particles, and also in a different project for polishing effluent for tertiary treatment. So, in summary, it's always good to remember where the final destination of your pollutant is, because if you're running a wetland system, you have to think, will that run effectively for 10, 20, 30 years? If not, you have to have a system where you're removing, like dredging to remove the phosphorus, or harvesting. So floating treatment wetlands have benefits of adapting to different water levels. Also the roots, they don't absorb the pee that's already been settled out from settling. They're taking it from the water column. So a lot of plants that are in the bottom, that pee's already been sequestered by the sediments really, and then they're reabsorbing it. So sometimes the plants can actually bring phosphorus out if the plant at the bottom, whereas in floating treatment wetlands they don't. They encourage settlement. Also, they're easy to retrofit. If you have a basin, you can put a floating island in there. So it's quite a cheap solution, really, for something that's already established. Okay, basically, I won't go into details, but this was just a study we did at the university where we're looking at floating islands for treating marine aquaculture waste. And we found Juncus maritimus and Salicornia survived. A lot of plants didn't survive with their roots directly in the seawater. So, and they grew quite successfully. We're still waiting results back to see how much was taken up by them, but the ammonium and phosphorus, phosphate decreased quite rapidly in 3 batch processes. Okay, thank you very much.